This is Gerie DiPiano, and you are listening to the Love Mia Vita podcast. Today, I have one of our frequently attending guests, Dr. Juliana Hauser, who is a psychologist. And for those of you that have not had the pleasure of listening in or viewing, let me share a little bit of information about Dr. Hauser. Dr. Juliana leads conversations about relationships, agency, sexuality, intimacy, and with so much more because she is a professional, but she has great expertise, but she also makes it fun. Now, she does have some great professional credentials. She received her PhD in counseling education from the College of William and Mary, and she is considered a thought leader and sexpert, expert, diving deep into hard to have conversations that all of us need to be having. The jewel of Dr. Juliana's practice and offering is something called the Revealed Course. She also certifies others to train with her. And if you'd like to learn more, you can visit her website, dr-juliana.com. So, Juliana, it's a pleasure to have you once again on the Love Mia Vita podcast.
Thank you for having me. I always love our time together.
We do have a lot of fun. There's no doubt about it. We've had so many great podcasts together, and I know we have many more planned coming up in the future. Today, we're going to discuss a topic that tends to present itself at midlife. Not that that's exclusively when this may happen, but it really is when partnering, whether it's a significant partnership relationship or divorce. So if you happen to be married, it's divorce. But we know that there are lots of folks that don't actually do the marriage thing, but still have a very significant long-term relationship. And when things start to head in the wrong direction, or when we have that self-reflection and we determine that perhaps this isn't where we want to be or need to be, it can be very unsettling, to say the least. So we're going to talk about how to rebuild after we end this long-term relationship, whether it's marriage or a significant partnering relationship. And at least from the marriage perspective, we know that the statistics are relatively significant. 40 to 50% of first marriages end in divorce, and then 75% of second marriages end in divorce. And some folks try and it still doesn't work out. So in your professional capacity, perhaps we can talk about how we get to the point where how do we know that it's time to move on?
That pathway is different for everybody. But what I have found, if you're the one deciding that this relationship has come to its completion, then typically it's been a pretty long road to get to that place. And long doesn't necessarily mean in a calendar days, but long as in an emotional self-reflective dive. For some, it's death by 1,000 cuts, and others, it's just a sword cut, that there's something significant that happens. And I have yet to find somebody that along that way of the reasons why, that it doesn't intersect with their world belief and their belief of themselves, their self-worth. So you're dealing with three different things all at once. You're dealing with the thought of a relationship ending. You're dealing with, well, what does this mean for me? Who am I in this situation? And you're looking at, how does this fit into the greater world of how I think how it works? So how do you know? You know when the thought of staying feels so incongruent with who you are and your values and where you want to be heading in life is kind of the most common theme that I've seen. When it's the opposite, when it's someone else telling you that it's over, that's very different. When it's not mutual or it's not what you wanted. I have found that the rebuilding process is different, because now you're dealing with the suddenness to it, with lack of agency in it, with lack of choice. Even if you quote saw it coming, or even if you look back and think, yes, if you didn't decide it, if you weren't a part of the decision, it feels very different. And so then it's a matter of not deciding that you're going to end it, but how am I going to come to terms with this change in my life?
I think it's a very important distinction, because you're right. If one party may think that everything is going along swimmingly and they see nothing wrong with the relationship, and the other party makes the decision to end the relationship, and you feel blindsided. You potentially feel blindsided and a little lost, and perhaps you've given it 100. In your view, you've given it 150%, and perhaps you have given it 150%. So it would feel like your agency was taken away from you, because you're dealing with consequences, but you didn't make the decision. So you're still dealing with the consequences of someone else's decision. That can feel really bad. And I would imagine that in that situation, rebuilding could take a different type. There would be different tactics, different strategies and tactics to try to move on from something like that. Maybe we can even separate the two. So in the one instance where I guess there were 3 scenarios. One where it's mutual. Second scenario where you, in this case, the person that's watching or listening to this, made the decision. And then what if you're on the other end of that? What if you're receiving the consequences, but really didn't want the relationship to end? So those would be at least 3 scenarios that I could see. So let's talk about the in the first scenario, which is that you mutually agreed.
So this is one of my favorite places as a couples therapist, is having either in our work together, the couple realizes jointly that they no longer want to be together, or they come to me to help that process be loving and respectful. It's just, I'm hesitant to use the word joy, but kind of, because to me, I think it is such a beautiful experience to lovingly acknowledge the meaning that you had in each other's lives, and to say, and we're not moving forward like we are right now, whether you have children or not in that process. And I'm thinking of this one couple in particular, that they weren't married, and they part of the rebuilding process was having a very loving goodbye, in which they honored what they meant to each other and what their experience was for one another, its lives, how they impacted each other positively, both of them being accountable for what they think contributed to the relationship not working, and both wishing each other well in the next chapter. It was about a 3-hour session, and it was loving and healing and beautiful. And I don't want to act like it was then all unicorn and rainbows afterwards, because there were details and things that got harder along the way. That gets difficult. I've seen people absolutely disintegrate over picking China in a divorce rather than like the actual things that made it difficult. But when you are mutually agreeing to part ways, what I like in the rebuilding process is to do this 3-part question, which is, what did I learn about myself because of this relationship? What did I learn about relationships in general because of this relationship? And what am I learning that I want to be different, to either to keep or to be different as I move into other relationships? And a mistake that I think people make is when they meet someone who's been divorced, and especially if they meet someone who's divorced twice, that they think that means they don't believe in love, or they don't believe in the, like, quote, sanctity of marriage. But I've actually found that to be quite different. Actually, there's a lot of times that when you do choose divorce, it's because you are choosing a different kind of love. You are believing in partnership and the good of it. It just is what you're in right now. You've either outgrown, or the relationship has changed and doesn't work for you anymore. And so I find it not to be, we talked about this earlier, like I don't find it to be a failure. I feel it to be actually a testament to moving into a truer place of who you are and where you're going. And so part of the rebuilding in that is honoring it for each of you. and being accountable to who you were in that relationship, in the positive and in the challenges, is a really crucial part in rebuilding after mutual too. It's a crucial part of all of 3 scenarios, but it's really important when it's mutual. And then having, and there'll be themes throughout all of them, but I guess what stands out in the mutual one is, okay, so now we've been peaceful. We get to say we were amicable. Often that's like with one of my divorces was a amicable one that I do wear at the badge of honor. But now what are you going to do? So now that you've completed this relationship, what are you going to put into motion into this next chapter for you? And really taking ownership of that. This is your chance to, as you know yourself better, then we hope as you know yourself better than you did previously, how are you going to make choices for the people you surround yourself with, for how you're going to show up in these relationships, connections? What self-work do you need to focus on in order to step into this new chapter truthfully and in a more fulfilled way?
And in this scenario, when you come to that mutual understanding that we're not here after what we thought we were here after, so we're going to be gone, so we're going to move on. I always call it the hereafter conversation. So when you both agree that makes sense that you're not after the same things, but you don't dislike one another, but you just weren't cut out to be together for the rest of your life. You still need to think about rebuilding. And I know you talk about this, rebuilding on your own terms. Mm-hmm. So if both parties agree that it's time, let's talk about how you rebuild on your own terms.
Mm-hmm. So depending on how long or intimate the relationship was, you may have to do some disentangling from that life and the decisions that you were making together, the identity that you had formed or were forming with this person. And sometimes that disentanglement is a relief. You feel like you're unloading baggage and you're unloading parts that were like clothes that weren't ever yours and didn't fit right. Other times it feels like it's being ripped away from you, even if it's the choice that you were agreeing to. So in that process, it's a lot of, and you've heard me use this terminology before, it's a lot of just finding out, like, what do I want? What do I want? What are my yeses and nos to everything at this point? And what do I need? Those are very different things. And it's not always easy to sit in that questioning, especially because you're not in a bubble. Friends, family, even coworkers, everyone's got an opinion of what you should be doing at this point too. So it can be overwhelming to have all this support that gives unsolicited advice to you. So you really have to listen as if you have an advisory committee, but stand as the president of your decisions. Listen, but it's up to you. You're the one living this life. You are the one that will be living out the choices that you're making. So you really want to be in a place of truth about who you are, understanding of what you need and what you want, and then living them and surrounding yourself with people who will support that.
It sounds like that could cross boundaries of all of the different scenarios that we discussed. So irrespective of whether it was someone else's choice, your choice, or a mutual understanding that it was time to move on. You're right. You do, even, in those scenarios, you get the unsolicited advice. And I guess it's important to think about who you choose to be part of your advisory committee, because let's face it, depending upon the choice, if it's a person that's uber conservative and they feel you need to stick this out to the bitter end, could be a family member, could be a religious that, is part or part of your cultural community. So you may get advice, you have to kind of sift through all that and decide what feels right to me. It's really all about you. It's not about them.
And that's not selfish or unhealthy. It's actually responsible to sit there and take self-responsibility for the choices that you're making. And I think that gets lost in the rebuilding process also. especially if you are being drowned in opinions and advice and how I did this and this worked for me, or I read this article, or think about this, or you're not doing this right, or you've got to try this. There's a lot of that happening, and most of it is well-intentioned. Most of it is, not all of it, but most of it is. And even the well-intentioned can be really difficult if you are even in a kind of solid, assured place. But that's not often the case with most endings of significant relationships. There's often a time of grieving, even if it was by choice. And so you want to be mindful of how you're making decisions and who you're listening to in the grieving time period as well, or the most recent part of the grieving time period too. Grieving can last for a very long time. Again, even if it was something that you chose to do as well. But yes, you want to be careful who you're surrounding yourself with. And I can later give you my list of the all-stars of who I would put on your committee.
Yeah, I would love to know what that list would look like. And I'm assuming that most of the listeners and viewers would feel the same way. Who would you put on your committee? I kind of have an idea as to who I might want, and I know who I definitely would not want on that committee, but I'm curious to hear who that would be. And I guess in the scenario where one person was just, everything, they thought everything was fine, it's okay. I'll make this a little humorous, perhaps, in the case where one partner just, didn't really think that they were getting enough from the relationship, and the other partner felt that they were giving 150%, even though, they were pretty irresponsible and kind of lackadaisical. And, one party was kind of investing all their energy. So, again, complete mismatch. And maybe it evolved over time. We see this with folks that start off together in a career, and they shift, and one party may carry the load and the other party just doesn't. And this is not to be sexist. This could be the woman who's, had the kids, had the career, still working, and husband is coasting because the wife has been pulling all of the load for years. And all of a sudden he says, "Hey, what's happened here? Am I not good enough for you?"
Mm-hmm. And I've also seen couples where they mismatched on seeing the severity of the problem. So perhaps they knew they were fighting more, they knew there was a disconnect, or they weren't having sex anymore, or they were roommates instead of spouses, but they thought it wasn't that bad. Or they didn't take the complaints or the anger or the sadness serious enough. And like, we've got time to fix this. And then all of a sudden there's not time anymore to fix it. The person has made the decision, or you make the decision, and you're over it at that point. And to me, when I first started as a therapist, I remember thinking, how do people get surprised? Besides like an affair, how are people surprised that their partner is unhappy? Until I quickly realized, oh, right, Juliana, you like communicating. And that's one of the reasons why you're in therapy, but not everyone does. And not everyone knows how to. And in fact, I saw that it just, obviously now many years into my career, I see how often that actually does happen, how people can live a life together without really sharing a lot of inner thoughts, and without really even problem solving, that they're just going through the motions and things, and have no idea how far apart they are actually. When that's the case, especially when it's something that you weren't expecting, when you're the one that didn't think this was going to be happening, what I have found in the rebuilding process that's different than the others is there's often a sense of betrayal. And I don't mean infidelity betrayal, but a betrayal of safety, a betrayal of, I thought we were on the same page of kind of no matter what. Or at least I'd have a pretty big heads up about this. And so they have to revisit trust, and they have to revisit believing people, or understanding what it means to quote, count on somebody, or to be, I hear the words dependable or counting on a lot more in the rebuilding process, and a whole lot of, why wasn't I wanted? Why wasn't I good enough? Why didn't you fight for me? Why didn't you give me a chance? Why did you just leave and abandon me? And those are very different rebuilding places. Those are core wounds. Those are soulful things that don't happen very quickly. And no advisory board is going to be able to help you in that process. You have to walk along that road. You can gather information, but it's really a road that you need to rebuild. And it needs to be in the forefront as you're rebuilding your life and the details of things. For the ones that I've worked with or known in my personal life that they're in that category, the ones that have the hardest times are the ones that cannot get through that looping of I can't believe this. And
they're emotionally devastating, right? Because perhaps you lack the self-awareness, you feel that you've been it's emotional harm that you feel. In those scenarios, is it best to seek therapy to try to dig deep into yourself, to try to understand perhaps not what you did necessarily, but how to move forward? Because again, you may be confused, you feel blindsided. So is it best to seek a therapist in that scenario?
I do. I absolutely think so, because what you need to do is you need to be protective of this place of you have been blindsided for whatever reason. It does, like, this is not the place to have blame in it on yourself or others. It is your life. How I term it is, you have just had on your whiteboard of life that you had all mapped out. Somebody didn't just like accidentally go up against it and smudge a part of it. Someone just came and erased the whole part of from here forward. And that does not feel good to have that happen. And so you have to have that supporting grieving, and you want to find somebody who isn't going to push you too far into that place of let's get back into it. And we're going to get you going and get you getting into the new hobbies and getting into starting a new life again solely. So attend to those feelings of grief, and then find that balance with a professional. And then you can add in divorce coaching or support groups that are, there's a lot out there that you can find of when you're ready to start doing the nuts and bolts of things. And again, it isn't like, okay, now I've grieved and now I'm moving into this phase of the rebuilding. It happens simultaneously, but don't overlook the part of being sad and recognizing this. And then you move into, okay, so back to agency. So then now what? How do I start rebuilding it? And sometimes people pick up that dry eraser pen very quickly and they start writing, and that's fine. Others, it takes a while to do it, that they have resentment, they have sadness, they are terrified of what they're going to have to learn and change in order to move into this new chapter.
In this phase, though, and I would say irrespective of whether someone else initiates this and you're on the receiving end where it was mutual, you refer to taking control of what you want. Mm-hmm. Really owning this time, what you want to do, what you want to eat, where you want to go. How important is that in the process of rebuilding?
It's pivotal. It's pivotal. It goes along with several other things that are very helpful as well. But to me, it's the point of going into this next chapter is, no matter how you got to this chapter, walking there, being shoved there, or finding yourself there, this is the time to take charge of who you are now and what you know about yourself, because invariably the process from when you said yes to this person to where the no has occurred, you have changed. The process of going through the no, and however it happens, has changed you also. So let's figure out what are the pieces in that change that serve you, that serve who you want to be, where you want to go in your life. And let's look at the pieces that don't. And let's work on those to remove them or to shift them into something that does serve you. And that all starts with those very clear, and I will not use the word simple, questions of what do I want? What do I need? What are my yeses? What are my nos? and pausing after every time you ask this question and listening to your body, listening to your feelings, listening to your thoughts. That pause is so pivotal to this new chapter. Again, so you're not influenced. You're not trying to do what everyone else does. You're not trying to do what the next book says. You're not trying to do what worked for your neighbor. None of that. It is at your own pace, in your own way, so that you are authentically creating this life. And to me, it's a positive of being in this chapter. There are a lot of people who have long-term relationships, but they're not happy ones. And we, reward the number of the anniversary, but we're not necessarily looking at the health of the relationship. And they don't have, people in those circumstances don't always have the chances to really start on their own terms and have freedom to have yeses and nos. And so again, like, I'm not trying to be toxic in the positivity of things when things are, just tough or hard, but this is a place where you can find a whole lot of strength, a whole lot of change and motivation in your life. And it's where I see people take off. When people are able to start asking themselves those questions, aren't afraid of the I don't knows, and just keep asking it, that's when I know that there's going to be a rapid change in this chapter, and it's exciting.
And, listening to you, this is not about being selfish. Perhaps you were totally unselfish in the relationship, in the long-term relationship, because let's face it, we do compromise when we're in a long-term relationship. Maybe we live in a state or in a city that we really, it was something that our partner wanted, but not necessarily that what we wanted, or, we had dinner at a certain time, or we did certain, we had certain hobbies that we did together because it made one partner happy, but the other one was less so excited about it. Now it's time to say, wait a minute, who am I? What did I really love? Why did I gave these things up? Right? Because I was trying to be a good partner and compromise. I don't have to do that anymore. I mean, there's a certain maybe it is selfish. There's a certain amount of that selfishness that kind of feels empowering to me. Like, wow, I know this is done, but here's who I really am. This is what I can do now. I have the rest of, whatever, I have the rest of my life to now pursue the things that I really loved, and to get back to, the purpose. What is my purpose? My purpose wasn't necessarily to be the moderator of all the fights and the person that compromised, right? And the doer of all things, or maybe the undoer of all things, depending upon your particular circumstances. But yet, we have this, we tend to have these issues of success, which means, you said it earlier on, success means you have the years that you add up and you celebrate them. And that's the years in the partnership or the marriage. And then there's the failure if it doesn't work out. Quite frankly, and maybe this is a little edgy, but if you're in a partnership, you should have a contract. And you should have a termination provision, right? And a provision that, gives you the right to renew or for early termination if you default, and you have time to cure, right? I mean, you put it in some, it sounds kind of cold, but maybe not. Maybe that's right. So you have milestones that both of you need to accomplish. And if you're not getting there, at least it becomes pretty obvious when it's, when it isn't working out. So maybe it should be, it's not a failure. It's just contract didn't work out. It's not a failure. Just became self-aware. So let's talk about this success versus failure dichotomy.
Yeah, I love that. I love that idea. I actually think there's so much merit to it. And it could really, an idea like that could really help normalize the experience that so many people struggle with. And that so much of our society isn't set up to support a long-term relationship anymore that's healthy and happy. So why do we look at it as failure and as success? Oh, I don't know. Well, we could get into lots of societal reasons as to how we got to this place, but how do we extricate ourselves from that belief? It isn't to me about length of a marriage is about fulfillment. It's about each partner feeling like the reason why they're in a partnership still is relevant and is still active and healthy and fulfilling to them. I would celebrate that whether it's 1 year or 50. That is beautiful. I'll often ask, and I'll often start a lot of my therapy sessions with couples as in like, what is the point of a partnership? Not why are you two together? Why did you fall in love? But what is the point of partnering with somebody romantically and sharing your life with them? And it's pretty often people have not thought of it, or it's hard to articulate it, or they have different reasons as to why. And that's not necessarily a bad sign, but it's interesting that we don't talk about it. So when we look at failing versus succeeding, I think we're using the wrong criterion on this. And that's just across the board what we do. We look at anything besides number as none of our business. But I think we've all been at anniversary parties, or we've all seen things that were like, well, I mean, yeah, it's like a golf clap kind of image, or like, yeah, you did it. I don't know how you did it. Or you'll say like, they've been, they are happy together. It's not the kind of marriage I would want, but they're happy together. Like those kinds of caveats to things. And in some ways, it isn't our business. Two people decide actively and with agency that they're right with each other. What they decide that partnership looks like and feels like, if it's consensual and healthy, then and safe, then you get to have relationship agency, just like you get to have personal agency in that. But I wish that what we really could stop is feeling like, if it's quote failed, that it is such a attribution to you being a failure. I hear that I'm embarrassed, I have failed. The one thing I wanted in life, I failed at. I hear that over and over and over. And I said it myself. It's the one thing that I couldn't accomplish, the one thing I couldn't make happen. And what a shame that we've attached our self-worth so much to this. And instead of other qualities in relationships instead. I also think, and I've said this to you before too, like I love Sarah Blakely of Spanx talks a lot about inviting yourself open to failures. And I'm not saying like, yeah, let's all go out and marry 100 people and just be so thrilled at failing. Because I mean, there's some logistics. And if you have kids, there's a lot that goes into unwinding a contractual marriage and a familiar one also. But what is so wrong and bad about failing at this? And I prefer to use the word completed. And I heard Glennon Doyle use that word, and it landed with me very strongly. Like, it's completed. It's very similar to the quote that there is a reason and a season for relationships. Very similar to that. That, we, and Esther Perel talks about this, like we just have this almost toxic belief that relationship has to be long-term, and it has to be one person for your whole life if you are going to be proud of the relationships that you've been in. And I haven't seen that play out for a lot of people. I have, though, and I'll have people say to me, do you know anyone that's happy? Can you tell us anyone that's happy in a relationship? We've had this conversation in different podcasts. Yes, I do know many people. I do. And some are first marriages, some are not. Some are not marriages at all. And there's definitely, we talked about this previously, there's definitely threads throughout that. But if you didn't get that the first or second time, if you did have it and it changed, because life happens, you get to know each other better, or you stop learning who you are, or life is really difficult at times too. And you find out how you handle things differently, or if you have illnesses or mental illness or career stuff, or life doesn't turn out how you think it's going to. That can be very difficult to navigate individually, let alone. So why is it a failure if we decide this partnership isn't best for either of us, or if we're all involved in it? And so I would I guess the last thing I'd say about this is some people who disagree with that stance are afraid that if we don't hold marriage as the most sacred, and if we don't hold long-term relationship as the most sacred to how it holds our society, that we are going to all fall apart. And studies and statistics just belie that. That isn't happening. That isn't the reason. And when we had lower divorce rates, it did not make us healthier, happier people, privately, individually, or collectively. And I hope that we are in a phase of rebuilding this, revamping what relationships, marriages, spouses, and partnerships looks like. And I think part of that is finding a different word besides failure.
It's interesting to think about this in the context of the rebuilding process, right? Because if you feel that you have failed, then it makes it much harder to take that next step and to rebuild. If you feel that, you've learned something, right? So what did you learn? What did you learn about yourself? What did you learn about the person that you partnered with? What did you learn about the circumstances? Then you can give yourself, it can be liberating, and you can think about how to take that next step forward. And actually, I would view that as the success is coming to a better understanding of your circumstances so that you can move forward, perhaps in a more healthy relationship or a different kind of a relationship. I throw in a little humor here. I'm a big fan of Grace and Frankie.
Oh, me too.
And, it reminds me of when they learned that their husbands were in love with one another and they were moving on. And in that case, the wives felt very betrayed because their husbands had chosen to move on, and they had chosen a different type of relationship and the husbands chose to move on with one another. So even a different type of sexual relationship in partnering. And yet they both came to learn so much about themselves and even the way that they had guided their relationship. So I liked the moving on piece. They both did move on in very different ways. And in some ways, they learned to respect one another in all their differences. So they became close friends. So some pretty unexpected things can happen when you start to look introspectively about that. So I do view that, I hate the word failure, but in another sense, if you don't fail, you don't know how sweet it is to finally take that next step and feel good about the next step that you've taken. And I think that might be a cliche, but in any event, it's okay to fail. It's better to be able to take that failure and learn from it and move on.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, there are some cases where it is just very harmful and toxic, and there isn't a lot that you can glean from it that was positive. And I know that exists. But it's a healthy place in your rebuilding process when you don't throw everything out from that relationship. Again, going back to that, what did I learn about relationships in general, but also like when you can have kindness and compassion, especially when you feel harmed in it, when you can see the person is fallible and human, that some of the hurt and pain that you've had time and distance from, that you can see wasn't personal, even though it was and felt personal and affected you greatly. Or you can have compassion for yourself in that process. That doesn't mean you have to be super friendly. It doesn't mean that you have to write a note with it. But I have found there to be when there's bits and pieces that you can feel grateful for authentically, not like a Hallmark card, but like grateful, like truly feel that way. It often denotes a new chapter in the next chapter too.
It's easy for us to have this conversation when you're living it. And, I've lived it. Probably lots of women, maybe men who are listening to this podcast, have lived through it. And it can be very destabilizing. So there's you say that it is a very difficult time, and you need to have a high tolerance for ambiguity. So it may be economically destabilizing to you. Perhaps there are children that are involved. Perhaps there are other entanglements. Maybe you have a business that's in the middle of all this, or there's a third party in the middle. It could be a party, someone that you know, or someone that entered the picture, and you don't know how you're going to navigate all of these different things. So with all of that, it's probably something that requires us, you're dealing with all this ambiguity, requires us all to think, how do I take care of myself? Right? What do I do?
And I'm often met with surprise when someone's asked me, like, what can you do in the rebuilding process, or what is one of the most powerful things you can do, when I say have a new relationship with ambiguity and embrace it, understand it. Like, what are you talking about? Like, how is that going to help me? But what I have found is, so often, because of the destabilizing that you're speaking of, because that is just such an awful time for most people, that you start looking for certainty. And a lot of what happens in the midst of a divorce or end of a relationship, or in the kind of like the rebuilding after the ashes are there, is nothing that feels certain in your life. So you cling to that, thinking that's going to make you feel safe, thinking that's going to be where that's the roadmap. This is the arrow that go down here. And that's a mistake. It's a mistake to do that. What is helpful, what I have found to be more long-term and sustainable, is if you go back to those pauses and you're like, okay, I don't know. I know this, I don't know this. And you don't force decisions. There's always caveats to this. There's always things that sometimes you do have to decide, where am I going to live if you've lost your home in this process? But I'm talking more of the soulful things, the worldview things, and sometimes the logistics of it, that you get okay with not knowing right now. You find peace in the groundedness of you. That moment when you realize, I'm going to be okay. I don't know how, and I don't know what this is going to look like, in a week, in a year, but I am okay right now, and I'm going to be okay. That is a magical moment that opens up so many doors for you. And it seems counterintuitive. What seems for most people, which is, I'm going to get this done, I'm going to get this done, I'm going to da, 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 da. And I think there's times that you do get busy like that, but that has to be a smaller percentage than the moments that you're sitting still, soulfully or logistically.
And knowing that you can take control, and you can do it one small step at a time. Because I think when we're confronted with something of this type of magnitude, we tend to want to absorb it all, take it on, if you want to check boxes, tick things off. But we don't have to tick everything off at once. We can take one small step and feel safe and victorious in making that one tiny step, and knowing that that is within your control. That is what you can control. Maybe you can't control the multiplicity of different kinds of things that are going on around you, and you feel like your life is a hot mess. So what are the things that you can control? And maybe it's just I can go to the grocery store. I can buy exactly what I want for dinner. I don't have to have dinner at 6 p.m. I can now have dinner whenever I feel like having dinner, and I don't have to make a full meal. Maybe I just need to make a salad this evening. I mean, it sounds stupid and trivial, but that can be empowering in and of itself, because you made that decision. And then tomorrow's another day, and you could take small steps the next day and the next day after that. Yeah, having lived through this at an early part of my life, luckily didn't have children, but yeah, I felt pretty much like I was out of control, inherited a lot of financial obligations, had to deal with those financial obligations, a little bit of the embarrassment of, well, what's wrong with me?
Mm.
So guilty as charged of, feeling like, hey, must be something wrong with me because all my friends are still in a relationship, not me. It's tough to get past that. So for anybody that's listening, been there,
Same.
know the pain, know the pain.
Yeah, and I've also and one of the things I'd add to my story of my first husband was that we got married young and married before most people in my friend circle, and then divorced before. I was the only one in a large part of my extended family that was going through a divorce, had ever been divorced. And I was the only at that point and the first of my friend group to go through a divorce. So I didn't have a lot of examples either, and felt very exposed, felt very unclear, felt like I carried the weight of embarrassment on the family, and that I had done something really wrong and no one else had done that thing wrong. And so what did that mean? Now, years later, as other people started joining the club, I put in quotation marks, obviously some of that changed, but I wish, when we've talked through like the tips, and when I talk to people now, I talk a lot, not just of what I've seen for myself, but what I wish I had known, what I wish I had known back then. When I think back on what I focused on, and it was so much was wasted energy that didn't help me in the new chapter at all. It didn't help me self-grow. It didn't help me partner better. It didn't help me make good choices at the time. And I really want to, again, acknowledge, of course, there's a grieving that comes with this, but also this is a chance to really get to know yourself on a better level and a deeper level, that you're going to make better choices for yourself. Different choices, more aligned choices. And that stands with ambiguity too. I wish I had understood how powerful that concept was back then.
Interestingly enough, the opportunity for self-reflection, which is also a very important point that you raise in our conversation, is something that I've done it now. Back then, I probably didn't do as much self-reflection, and that would have helped me to perhaps rebuild much more quickly. It took me a while because I felt wounded. I was the one that made the choice, but it was kind of the choice was thrust upon me. I really didn't have a choice. It was either stay in a really bad situation or be courageous and leave. And I made the right decision. I know I made the right decision. At the time, it felt really awful. And if I had taken time for self-reflection, something that I tell my younger self, if I could have given advice to my younger self, I would have said, do more self-reflection, take stock of who you are, what you want, and what the next phase of your life is going to look like. And it's sometimes that's really tough because, it doesn't matter whether you're in your 20s, 30s, or 50s. It's a really tough place to be. So again, I don't want to diminish anyone that may be listening or watching this, but self-reflection is super important. And I know you talk about that a lot, and you keep coming back to these 3 little questions. So I think we should remind our listeners and viewers of those 3 little questions, because they're really important in the rebuild process.
What have you learned about yourself because of this relationship? What have you learned about relationships in general because of this relationship? And what are you learning? What have you learned that you want more of, less of, that you need more of and less of? And, and I want to add to that, which is when you're going through a divorce or have been through a divorce, it doesn't happen when time stands still. So it's not like most people can go through the experience and then go on a year-long retreat and do all this self-reflect. Most people are having to keep doing their life on a day-to-day basis and still shower. And if you've got kids, take care of kids, and work if you're working, like those kinds of things. And so it can get very easy to overlook the foundational aspects of rebuilding again, which is why professional help can help you. At least you'll have that hour that you'll do it, or that 2-hour support group that you're in. But I urge you also to do it on your own. Have that feel like a necessity instead of a luxury. And those are just 3 questions that I find to be powerful and good starting points, but they're just good starting points. There's more questions to be asking, and more things, more tentacles that can show you so much more and help you find hope. I've said this to you previously, but it holds true in this context too, that people can live a long time in pain. They cannot live a long time without purpose. And sometimes when a relationship ends, it was a big part of your purpose. And when that is gone or is changed, no matter the circumstance of it, you need to figure out what this new purpose is. And some people will know it quickly. Other people, it's going to be a longer road, but make sure you're doing it truthfully and not by influence of other people, and not by what you think it should be. Not trying to prove yourself to anyone else, but sitting there thinking like, so who am I? And where do I want to head? And with the choices that I have, what are the best ones that serve me? And know that that's your responsibility. And it is your pleasure to be able to ask those questions. It's a privilege to be able to ask those questions. Don't squander that.
You know, you are a psychologist, a licensed family and marital therapist. And so for those that are listening, viewing, you are a luxury for a lot of folks, right? We know that. Not everyone is fortunate enough to be able to find someone like you, or to be able to afford this type of support. But it may be really important, because you talk about, dealing with the ambiguity and trying to find your purpose and trying to move forward. But let's face it, sometimes we're just stuck. And finding those resources is going to be super important if you're feeling stuck or feeling hopeless and feeling like, your life, is the life you knew it was over. So we want to be sensitive and thoughtful about those individuals that are in that place. There are support groups that are available. We will provide those resources to you in a separate email, so you could check out our blog post, and we will also include that in the notes for the Love Me Evita podcast, so that those of you that do need this type of support but perhaps cannot afford the professional support that you might get from a psychologist, that there are some resources that may be available to you and some groups that you can access so that you can move ahead, so that you can take those baby steps and do what you need to do for yourself.
Yeah, it's great. A very good point. And I want to add on to that. If you do want to seek support professionally, ask therapists if they have a sliding scale. I've always had scholarships available to people at a certain time period after, or while they're going through divorce or after, because it is shown to have the most financial impact on most people's lives. And it's when they need you, when they need support the most. There are lots of great books out there. There are people who are giving away content for free on TikTok and social media, and those little sound bites that can be very profound and very helpful. Always be smart about what you're consuming online. I also say caveat for like online chat rooms or groups, that just be a wise consumer. Sometimes there can be a synergy of negativity in it. And so if you ever see that, walk away from it. But there's also a lot of positive, wonderful support, so that you're not alone in this process. It can be so isolating to go through this experience, and it doesn't need to be. don't forget those statistics. That's how many people are going through this. So there isn't a need to be alone. There are people that may not have your exact story, but they will understand your feelings and your questions along the way. And I want to get back to one thing that we said they were going to about the different kinds of people that I would put into your support.
Oh, right. That's right. Who's on your advisory council?
Yeah. So these are the kind of people, this is like, the joke is, I wish I had this many friends, but let's just say these are the kinds of people that you want to have if you have access to these kinds of people. You want the person who's going to be snarky, the person that can just say the snarky things alongside you with you, because it is a part of the healing process to say snarky, unhealthy things you wouldn't want people to say. You want the person that lets you be messy over and over and over again. That's the same broken record that you just cry or angry or whatever it is, and they're okay in that process. They don't need you to learn it, to fix it or whatever. They can just hold that space for you. You want somebody who's a networker, who is going to find out where this music festival is, who is going to know the right lawyer, who is going to understand this real estate that's going to help you get a new house. Like you want somebody who's connected and a doer in that way. You want somebody who has been through an experience like this, but does not feel like they are your expert. So they often will say, like, for me, it did this, or like, this helped me, it may not help you, but here's an idea. But they always have that caveat to the advice that they give or the stories that they share. You want somebody who can give you hope, but isn't pushing you into this positive, happy place because they're uncomfortable with your sadness or you not moving fast enough for them. You want somebody who invites you to do things, that includes you, but it's okay if you're not ready or it's a no. And you want somebody that who doesn't force you, that doesn't make you feel bad, that either comes over or just is okay letting you live your life how you're living it. And then you want the person who is going to say, I know you. I've been through this with you, and I'm going to stay by you.
That's a pretty comprehensive advisory council.
Yeah.
It is.
We don't always get it, but it's a great group.
Yeah, it is. It is a great group. And we probably all have a little microcosm of that somewhere in our community, among our friend group, who you want to invite to the reservation, so to speak. So, yeah, I will definitely take those notes. And if I need them in the future, I don't think so. I hope not.
We show up or know that you're
Yeah. Maybe I can be one of those people. I hope so. I hope someone would include me in that group. But as always, Dr. Juliana Hauser, you are a wonderful guest. Not necessarily the most uplifting podcast when we're thinking about ending something, a significant partnership or moving, but we are talking about rebuilding. And I think that's the theme. Yes, life sometimes hands us those lemons and we have to do our best to make lemonade. And in the case of ending a relationship, finding those steps, thinking about how to rebuild, looking within ourselves, getting the right folks, surrounding ourselves with the right individuals that can help us through the process. All good advice. We are so grateful to you for being our guest on the Love Me Avita podcast. And for those of you that are listening in, Dr. Juliana Hauser is more than happy to receive your requests. You can reach her at dr-juliana.com. She does do virtual appointments. She's based in Kentucky. If you happen to live in Kentucky and you can make it to her office, that would be awesome because she is just fabulous. But if not, you can see her virtually, and I'm sure she would be very pleased to work with you. So thank you once again. And for all of our listeners and viewers, remember to stay well and love Mia Vita.